I wanted to talk a little bit about various minority groups from this country. This is a country of immigration. People tend to forget that America is a country which quintessentially is an immigrant nation. I'm an immigrant. I didn't come across the border from Mexico. I came from, middle class, probably a little bit too well educated England, but I've felt the immigrant experience. I do speak English, but it's a different language. The one I grew up learning is a different one. So I speak English, you speak American, put it that way. Anyway. I was asked a couple of years ago, I'll speed up now. I was asked a couple of years ago by AARP magazine, which has the largest readership of any magazine in the world, because when people get to, what is it, 55? Is it 50? Oh my God, I've qualified for 7 years. Anyway, you get AARP magazine, and I was asked to write an article for the 80th anniversary of Pearl Harbor. And the editor said to me, can you create a list of Americans and go through this list and ask them how Pearl Harbor changed their lives? This is December the 7th, 1941. What happened when you heard about Pearl Harbor? What then happened in your life? Well, as we know, for all Americans, things changed massively when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. And the editor said to me, can we have a Native American? Can we have a woman? Can we have an African American? Can we have a Japanese American? Can we have a list of this long list? And I'm like, well, I'm not sure whether I can find an African American who's 100 years old that remembers Pearl Harbor. I'm not sure that I can find a Native American. But anyway, I did manage to find quite a few of them. I would remind you that to legally have served in World War II, you'd have to be 98 now. So we are talking about the very end of this generation. So I'll just go through some of the characters that I chose. And as with all these subjects, when you talk about ethnicity, minorities, and race, you have to be somewhat careful, because you want to include everyone. You want to give different groups different weights. But I'm going to try and give you a smorgasbord, if you like, a picture of the extraordinary complexity of that force that defeated fascism and brutal militarism in the Pacific. It's quite extraordinary. So I thought I'd go through the war by date. So this is December 7th, 1941. And Thomas Begay is one of only 3, I believe, Navajo code talkers alive today. There were some 400 in World War II. He lives on Window Rock Reservation in Arizona, I believe. You can correct me, anybody here that it's from Arizona. I've actually been to that reservation, and when I say reservation, it really is a reservation. Native Americans in America in the 1930s earned on average a quarter of working class white Americans. That's a quarter. And I am sad to say that one of the few groups that have not benefited significantly since the 1930s in this country are Native Americans. They still earn around about a quarter, or even less in some places, than white working class Americans. So Thomas Begay joined the Marines, very proud member of the Marines. All of his family, by the way, all of his sons have served in the US military. It's an odd paradox that you get treated really badly, you serve your country, and then your entire family ends up serving the US military. And we'll talk a little bit about that sense of belonging and patriotism and what that means later on. So he's obviously still alive today, because I interviewed him recently. And he was at Iwo Jima. He saw the flag raising at Iwo Jima, that iconic moment in February 1945. And at the end of the war, he realized that he and his fellow code talkers, during the Battle of Iwo Jima, 12,000 Americans killed, that they'd sent over 800 different messages, and not one of them was incorrect. So a phenomenal contribution to the war effort. And sadly, one of only 3 alive today. So when we talk about minorities, I think this woman is very interesting. She's actually buried at Arlington, where we'll be later in this week. And she's the first Hispanic woman, but also the first Puerto Rican woman to serve in the US Women's Army Corps. And she actually arrived in North Africa in January the 27th, on January the 27th, 1943, and was one of 200 women in the US Women's Army Corps who served in North Africa. What was interesting is that they didn't have full status. They were treated as auxiliaries. So if they were captured by the enemy, for example, they would not be subject to the Geneva Conventions. They were not paid the same pay scale as other women or other people in the US Army. They were basically second class. So I think it's interesting that she raises the issue for me, which is that many women's lives were massively changed by World War II. They saw service. I'm going to show you a few more images. And of course, they left the home. They were no longer playing that traditional role, if you like, of the housewife. They went and worked, some of them 12-hour shifts in factories, in the making B-17s, making Shermans, doing men's jobs, because the men had obviously gone into uniform and were serving overseas. And what's interesting is that this 4 years of immense liberation from the kitchen, from the home, from these traditional roles, was something that many women, for example, Carmen, and many women that went and worked in factories, when the war ended, they were like, okay, well, I don't want to go back and be a housewife all the time. I love being a mother. I love being raising my family, but I'd like to have a job, or I'd like to serve on equal terms with other men in the army. One thing to note is that the GI Bill, which was introduced in 1943, the greatest piece of social engineering in US history, changed America more than any other legislative act, I believe, in American history, because it allowed you to have a middle class post-war. Working class GIs went to college for free. Imagine how radical that is today. Can you imagine being able to tell all of your students, by the way, you can go to college for free? How would that transform America? In the late 40s and 50s, it completely transformed America. Why do you think you have doctors, dentists, engineers, surgeons, lawyers that came from humble backgrounds? They didn't pay to go to college. That was the GI Bill. Also guaranteed medical benefits. It was born out of a massive, deep-seated paranoia in America that if all these millions of GIs came back and had to go on to dole queues or be unemployed, that there would be social division and there would be terrible riots and America would fall into anarchy. So the GI Bill, this immensely generous, important act of legislation, was born out of fear of the elites, thinking that these guys that had gone and fought and defeated fascism would come home and then would try and defeat authoritarian forces that denied them employment. But women were excluded from the GI Bill. So she served all the way through World War II, and I'm going to talk about other women that did too, and came back and didn't have that opportunity. They weren't given that opportunity. So I think what this raises is the issue that there's this beautiful window of opportunity. For the first time, you can be a black fighter pilot. There'd never been a black civilian pilot in America. Can you believe that? Before World War II, there was not a single black civilian pilot for an airline. World War II, suddenly they're fighter pilots and aces. And then they come back to America, and senators in Mississippi are saying, we must not have mongrelization. And the thing that we need to do most, and I can quote the guy's name later on, the thing that we need to do most is to make sure that we have segregation. We need to protect segregation as much as the atomic bomb secrets. And yet you had been fighting abroad to defeat the most evil racist regime, I believe, that's ever existed. So there are many ironies that pile upon ironies. This is Julia Parsons. I spoke to her a couple of years ago, and I was very intimidated by her because she's a lot sharper than I am, and she's like 100 years old. Really, really smart. And I asked her a woolly question, and she's like, what kind of question is that, you know? But she was a code breaker. She's a classic example. She went to college, Carnegie Mellon, and in 1943, she graduated. And for the first time, she went into the waves. The waves were begun in 1943. And because she was really smart and she'd been to college and she specialized in mathematics. She became a code breaker. And in fact, some of the work that she did was very important in terms of the Battle of the Atlantic. She broke certain U-boat codes. And she said, it troubled me because I thought that by my daily job, breaking these codes was going to get a lot of young Germans killed. And in fact, it did. So she ended the war with a great track record of service, and then couldn't talk about her job because it was top secret. So she said, I didn't get to talk to my family about what I did in the war. I said, look, I served my country. I've got the uniform. I had the uniform. It looked great. It was beautiful uniforms. And she didn't even get to talk to her family about what she did as a proud American woman until the 1990s, because it was all classified. And that's the case of a lot of people that worked in intelligence. Their families never got to know what they really did. And in fact, many of her peers passed away before they were allowed to actually talk about what they did in the war. So this is a really beautiful photograph. I wrote a book called The Bedford Boys, which is about, as you guys know, is about Bedford, Virginia, and how 19 guys from a community of around about 3,000 died on Omaha Beach in the first wave. And the pictures you see of Company A, a National Guard unit from the 1930s, look exactly like this, except for one big difference. This is the first and only entirely Chicano, basically Chicano National Guard unit or Army unit, full stop, in entire World War II. Every single guy in this picture is from the barrio. They're all from El Paso and that area of Texas. And it's the only unit that was all Chicano in World War II. And it was one of the most fearsome and most damaged units. And by damaged, I mean they've served in the Italian campaign in the 36th Infantry Division. That's a National Guard unit. It's a Texas National Guard unit that was chewed up over and over and over again, to the point where by the fall of 1944, the leadership lacked a kind of passion and authority within the US Army itself. The 36th Infantry Division was seen as the broken division. So they served in Sicily, and then particularly from Salerno. Last night I was boring you guys way too much. It was too hot, but I talked about Salerno and the Italian campaign. And this unit landed in Salerno in September of 1943. Actually 9th of September 1943, and suffered huge casualties over the next few months. In fact, in the Rapido River crossing in January 1944, and the Rapido is north of Salerno in Italy, over 75% of that unit there became casualties or were killed, which is an extraordinarily high number. If you looked at that picture and it said the Bedford Boys, on D-Day it would be over 92%. But 75% casualties is a very high number. The ethnic group, and I'm going to call them an ethnic group, the ethnic group with the largest number, with the highest number per capita, if you like, of medals of honor are Chicanos, are Hispanic Americans. So that tells you a lot about their fierce pride and sense of community. I will add a little story to this. I don't want to go on too long. I'll add a little story to this. When I was writing The Liberator, the book about Felix Sparks served in the 45th Infantry Division that fought side by side with the 3rd Infantry Division and the 36th. And that became the 5th Army in Italy. They fought in Sicily, they fought in Italy, and then they became the 7th Army and fought all the way to Dachau in southern Germany, end of the war. So that's 3 divisions making up the rump of this army. And he said to me that he came from Arizona, a small mining community in Arizona, massive unemployment in the 1930s. And he said that when I went to high school, there was massive discrimination against Mexicans. They were called the Mexicans. Huge discrimination. He said, when I went to Fort Sill in Oklahoma in early 1941, when I was called up, they had signs on bars that said, no Indians, no Mexicans. So we don't understand the level of, I don't think it's hard for us to understand the level of prejudice that existed against Mexican Americans in large parts of this country in the 1930s and through the war. But Sparks told me, he said that, I was there in Italy. He was there in Italy when these guys are fighting. And I thought to myself, these guys have not been in combat under my command before. He's a company commander, E Company 157th Infantry Regiment. And he said, why the hell are they going to bother giving their lives to this country? Why would you bother? You've been treated like that as a second-class citizen, denied employment, denied opportunities. It was the white boys in the mining town in Arizona that got one of the only jobs going, never a Mexican. Beaten up in the classroom at high school all the time. Why would you bother fighting for Uncle Sam? And he said, I was surprised that they did, and they fought harder than others. And I think I want you to think about that question. Why, if you are an African American, if you're Native American, if you're from this kind of background, why are you going to fight just as hard, if not harder? What is that about? So here we have Van T. Barfoot. So 44,000 Native Americans saw service in World War II. And I actually had the great privilege. He belongs to the 157th Infantry Regiment. That's the same infantry regiment as Felix Sparks, the Liberator. And I got to actually meet him. I stood on a stage next to him. My God, I'm going back way back now, in 2007 or 8. And it was at a reunion for his regiment. It was in Denver. And he scared the hell out of me. And there's this cliche that Native Americans are all braves, you know, that they'll slit your throat, they fight like cowboys and westerns, you know, like they're incredibly brave. He was just fierce. And he was fiercely patriotic. And he belonged to the Choctaw Nation. His grandmother was part of that nation, but he refused to take up that identity for the rest of his life. He didn't want to be identified as a Native American because as he told people, I didn't want anybody to give me any favors. He received a Medal of Honor for actions on the 23rd of May, 1944. 23rd of May, 1944 was the day I told you about last night when the Brother Division, the 3rd Division, lost over 900 Americans, 900 men from one division in one day. That's the day that you guys broke out from Anzio. He took out 3 machine gun nests, took several prisoners. It was just remarkable. If you look at the Medal of Honor citation, it's just like, wow, how could he do that? And then received, this is him in Epinal in France, receiving the Medal of Honor. From his division, there were 4 Native Americans that received the Medal of Honor, and he was taken off the line because by then, late 1944, the propaganda authorities back in the US realized that you were much more valuable as a living Medal of Honor recipient than dead. Let's not forget that over half of the Medal of Honor recipients from World War II, of those 472, over 50% died earning the ultimate medal. So he got into a big fight in the early 90s and was back in the news. There's a couple of things I want to talk about him that are really interesting. In the 90s, at the end of his life, he got into a big fight because of zoning laws. He lived in Virginia, I believe, zoning laws, and he flew his flag, and his flag was huge, it was humongous. It was like the size of this room. And the local zoning authorities said, like, you can't do that, it's against the law. And he said, you know what, do you know who I am? You know what I did in World War II? I'm going to fly my flag wherever I want, however I want, and as big as I want. And because of his background, because of his heroism in World War II, they basically gave up and said, okay, you can fly your flag, whatever you want, as big as you want, whatever. But what's interesting about him, and I want to go back to my notes here, is that, and there are some themes that emerge from this. So in 1945, he came from Mississippi, and there was a state senator there called Bilbo. That's not Bilbo Baggins from this guy called Theodore Bilbo. It's particularly obnoxious, but common back in 1945, racist. And he believed fundamentally in segregation. And one day he bumps into Van T. Barfoot from Mississippi, and Bilbo assumes that he's going to be just as racist as him, even though he is a Native American. And he basically tried to get Barfoot to support his cause, which was to continue segregation in the South. And let's not forget that even though in 1948, Truman desegregated the US military, in the 1960s, segregation in the National Guard continued with a vengeance throughout the South. So, you know, at that level, desegregation formally happened. But at a local level, in Virginia, even in many other parts of the United States, try being an African American and joining the National Guard. They fought in so many ways to stop any kind of advancement, years and years after the legislation formally was there. And Bilbo said, don't you agree? Don't you agree with our policy that we should continue to have segregation within the US Army? And he said, and these are very important words, he said, you know what? And this was in front of the press. He said, you know what? Us Southern boys, when we were over there fighting, i.e., unlike you, back here, war profiteering, us Southern boys, when we went over there, we saw lots of black soldiers, and they fought really well, just as hard as we did. So they need to be treated just the same as us. My point is that he had never fought alongside or seen any other blacks fighting in a war before. And many young men from the South who were blinkered, who were racist, etc., for the first time, they experienced what it was to be a full American in uniform fighting the same enemy. And they came back and their attitudes changed. So although we didn't have a revolution in attitudes and legislation post-war, as many people expected or wanted, certainly Native African Americans who served as fighter pilots in the Tuskegee Airmen, etc., they wanted change radically. It didn't happen. But what did happen was that many millions of Americans were exposed to other races in the same uniform for the first time. And that started to change attitudes. And it's that we believe. So when you get to 1964, 1965, there's two pieces of fundamental legislation, Voting Rights Act, Civil Rights Act. Those were voted for by whites in this city. And those whites that voted for it had that memory of World War II. There was that cultural memory of what minorities had done, African Americans had done in World War II, and their attitudes had shifted just enough to allow that legislation finally to pass. So anyway, those are a couple of things about him, and I'm going to speed up now, otherwise I'm going to run out of time. So here again is an interesting example. So you have a minority that actually, these are Chinese Americans. In 1882, there was a piece of legislation in the US, that the Exclusion Act, which basically said that if you're Chinese, you're not a full American, you're not an American citizen. That was not repealed until 1943. And yet Chinese Americans, you could argue perhaps the most discriminated against in terms of not even being allowed to be an American, they had the largest proportion of their population, over 25%, served in the military. That's over 25%. A quarter of all Chinese Americans in this country served in World War II. Sergeant Lauren Lowe, 27th of June, 1944, he was in Saipan, and he was driving a bulldozer. The Japanese attacked. His platoon were under fire, and he jumped into his bulldozer, plowed into a fire, and for that was received the Silver Star, because basically his actions led to saving some of his platoon. His grandfather had worked on the railroads. It's a classic Chinese immigrant story. His grandmother was a child slave in San Francisco in Chinatown. Can you imagine such a thing? That they had child female slaves in San Francisco in the 1880s. Very proud Chinese American. Some 25,000 Chinese Americans fought in World War II. And they never talked about it. He never talked about it. And it comes back to this notion of, why didn't World War II veterans come home and talk about what they did in World War II to their families, et cetera, et cetera. But he didn't talk about it. And it was only after he died that they found his family found a little clipping from a local newspaper describing his actions when he'd saved his platoon in Saipan. So here we come to the famous Black Panthers. There's Patton on the left here. I'm writing about Patton right now. And Patton, people have to remember, if you've seen the movie, Patton's aide, i.e. his servant, I'll call him because I'm being British, was a guy called Meeks, who was an African American. So from 1939 to the end of the war, the guy that he spent most time with, literally, Patton here, was an African American. They would talk about things all the time. Meeks was his name, Master Sergeant Meeks, and he said that, I would sit there, we would chat away about the weather and his family, etc., etc. And that reminds me of another story about the USS Tang, which is the most decorated submarine from US submarine from World War II. 2 presidential unit citations. Captain O'Kane received the Medal of Honor. And in the Navy, certainly on a submarine, blacks weren't even given a rating. You didn't even have a rating. I mean, you're nothing. And yet the Captain O'Kane of the Tang was served every day. Imagine being in that really claustrophobic space, that capsule, that bubble under the water. Or every day you're as close as you possibly can be to other human beings. And Captain O'Kane had a black African-American orderly. And they got on famously. They would spend hours and hours and hours together. Yeah, again, that proximity, that experience of being close to other people you would never have been close to like that in civilian life did break down attitudes. So O'Kane certainly was never, ever going to be a racist again. And Patton wasn't a racist. He was anti-Semitic, but he certainly, I'll rephrase that, he was sometimes made anti-Semitic statements, but he certainly wasn't prejudiced against African Americans. And famously, the Black Panthers is the first all-black army unit, tankers in World War II. They served with great heroism and very effectively. That 761st Tank Battalion was regarded as one of the most useful. And when I say useful, the guys that were trying to win World War II didn't mess about. They were not going to give false compliments. You either got the job done and killed the enemy and advanced and helped out other units, or you didn't. They didn't hand out, they didn't say you're good when you were bad. The 36th Infantry Division was a bad division, demoralized, didn't get the job done. 761st got the job done and received high plaudits from division commanders, etc. Patton famously, when he greeted them before they went into combat on November the 7th, 1944, he stood up on top of an armored vehicle. He had his pistol at his hip, and he said, I don't care. Basically, I don't care what color you are. You're going to go out there and you're going to kill those sons of bitches. And the more you kill, the happier I'll be. Doesn't matter. Which basically says a lot about Patton, but it also says a lot about how attitudes in parts of the US military were had changed a lot. This is not the Civil War anymore. This is we had a job to do, and if you could do it, it didn't matter what color you were. So they fought through the Battle of the Bulge, and interestingly, I think what's interesting about this unit is that it produced quite a few civil rights activists. So the NAACP had around 50,000 members before World War II. By 1945, it had over 450,000 members of the NAACP. And it's from that organization that you get the heart and soul of the civil rights movement post-war in the United States. They had been radicalized by war. And when I say radicalized, I mean they thought to themselves, why am I fighting racism and fascism here? Why am I seeing my black comrades die? Why are we just as good as all the white guys? And we have to go back to a place where we can't even sit on the same bus. It's hard to explain and moreover understand the level of anger that black veterans felt when they came back from Europe. The disillusionment. I mean, you had lynchings of GIs in uniforms, not just in the South. That's an appalling thing to happen to people who basically defeated mass genocidists. When we go to the Holocaust Museum and you think about a black American fighting, losing their friends all the way through that bitter long winter of 1944-45, and they actually did liberate concentration camps. And you think about the achievement of that immensity is incredible. So here we have John Basilone. If you've seen The Pacific, the TV series, he's one of the star characters. That's the TV series that came after Band of Brothers, set in the Pacific. and they chose key characters. And John Bassilone's a great character because that's him at Arlington. Because he's an Italian American. His father was born actually not far from Salerno, and I just wanted to talk a little bit about him. He received the Medal of Honor on the 19th of February, 1945. He basically fought for 2 or 3 nights. People say massively outnumbered and manned a machine gun. Didn't stop firing. I don't know how. Maybe for 2 or 3 days. Huge heroism. Received the Medal of Honor. Came back to the United States, and then didn't want to go on war bond tours anymore, didn't want to fly the flag for raising money for the US. He wanted to go back into combat, and he re-enlisted in the Marines. So you can imagine, you go and fight in hell, you receive the Medal of Honor, you know, you're a superstar, and then you say, no, I'm done, I want to go re-enlist. And then he was killed. Tragically, just a couple of months before the end of the war. It's an Italian American. So Italian Americans on the Eastern Seaboard escaped the destiny of many Californians who were Italian Americans. So 1941, we have Japanese Americans are enemy aliens. They're the enemy, so we have to intern them. Didn't have to, but they did. And then you have Italian Americans. They're also the enemy. We're fighting Mussolini and the Italians. So on the Eastern Seaboard, it was impossible to imprison several hundred, 600,000 US citizens. You're not going to do that. It's impossible. And local communities would have refused to allow that to happen because Italian Americans were so interwoven and so fundamentally American. I mean, if you go to Brooklyn or other places or New York, it's Little Italy is Little Italy. You're not going to put all of Little Italy behind a wire fence. In California, the numbers are relatively small. And in California, in 1942, we actually did send over 250 Italian Americans to internment camps. Joe DiMaggio, am I pronouncing that right? Holly, am I right in getting that right? Right. Joe DiMaggio, my English accent, my English attempt to pronounce an American Italian name. Anyway. Joe DiMaggio, his dad was not a full American citizen and was classified as an enemy alien, and they weren't allowed to go more than 5 miles from their home. So Joe DiMaggio's dad, the family had a restaurant on Fisherman's Wharf in San Francisco, and his dad couldn't go to his own restaurant because he was an Italian American. Finally, it wasn't until 1943 that basically the politicians in this country said, you know what, there's an awful lot of Italian Americans, like guys like John Basilone, that are fighting for this country, and we need to end this. There's an example of an immigrant group who you would think are so fundamentally a part of the fabric of this immigrant nation, being prejudiced against and having to deal with that. So this is Lieutenant General Morris Rose, one of the great division commanders, 3rd Armored Division at the end, and tragically died. I think he was 45 years old on the March the 30th, 1945. He was in a Jeep with other officers, and the SS surrounded him, and they killed him. Interestingly, he did not describe himself as a Jewish American. And when you go to his grave, which is in Luxembourg, I believe, he does not have the Star of David on his grave. And he was obviously a Jewish American, because I've written it there. That must be true. But he was part of that Jewish community that went into the US Army in the 20s and 30s that didn't announce they were Jewish because they knew that they would be prejudiced against. So better just to keep your mouth shut. He looks white, looks like a good wasp, So why handicap myself? I'm not going to talk about the fact that I'm Jewish. But anyway, it's interesting because there were 4.5 million Jews in America during World War II, and they served in just the same proportion as so-called white Americans in World War II. But someone like that, he is the most senior Jewish military figure within the US Army in World War II. The fact that he rose so high and he had to actually hide his Jewishness says a lot about attitudes towards the Jewish population within the United States. there's been a deep-seated anti-Semitism in this country and many countries for an awful long time. Harry Stewart here, Tuskegee Airman. He's still alive. He's like, I think he's 101. I'm not sure. He's 101. But I mentioned earlier on, and I want to stress this again, not a single black civilian airline pilot before World War II. This guy became, on April the 1st, 1945, he became he shot down 3 planes in one day. It's Easter Sunday. And we all know that you probably have heard about the Tuskegee Airmen, the famous Red Tails, 332nd Fighter Wing. Remarkable pilots, remarkable, incredible, all black unit of awesome fighter pilots. I mean, they were kick-ass. They were flying in a wonderful plane, by the way. That helped, as he told me. So it did help flying a P-47. That made a big difference because that was an extraordinarily effective, deadly plane. So he grew up near LaGuardia Airport. And when he was a kid, he was like, he just saw these planes landing every day. And he said, I want to be a pilot. And he said, World War II was the best thing that ever happened to me and to my fellow Black Americans, African Americans. He said, because all the things that some of us have wanted to do, particularly me, I wanted to be a flyer, I wanted to be a pilot. And there was no way that I was going to get to do that. But when we went to war, I got to live out my dream. I got to be a fighter pilot. I didn't just fly any old plane. I flew the best plane in the world. It was like, you know, the ultimate Porsche. Came back from World War II, applied to 2 airlines, rejected by both. And this goes to my point that you get this beautiful window of opportunity, of equality, of truth. In the sky, in a P-47, you're about as equal as you can be with anybody. Either you can shoot someone down or they shoot you down first. And you're going up against awesome enemy pilots. So that's a way of achieving something that is just like, there's no barrier to that. There's no limit. You know that you're the best. You're the top gun. And finally, I think it was in the 1980s, I have to check this, but finally the 2 airlines that rejected him, he didn't make this public, but someone else did. The 2 airlines publicly apologized for the fact that they had discriminated against him. This is a highly decorated, extremely smart, he went on to be a very well-educated guy that who wouldn't want him to be an airline pilot? And then we have a Japanese-American Medal of Honor recipient. He's the first. That was April the 5th, 1945. It's a classic Medal of Honor story. You know, he gets the Medal of Honor because he jumps on a grenade and he saves a couple of other guys' lives. That happened many times. That's probably the quickest way that you can receive the Medal of Honor is to jump on a grenade and give your life to save others. But, you know, here's the terrible irony of this is that he is fighting, and it's in the European theater. Let's not forget that we didn't send Japanese Americans to the Pacific for a very good reason, because their own side would have killed them. That was the main fear, that other Americans would kill them because they were Japs. I say Japs, that's what they were called. In fact, they were depicted as yellow monkeys in propaganda posters all through America. So last night when I was talking about this, and I don't want to get too diverted, but one of the things that complicates our discussion of Japanese Americans in World War II is that this country was taught, encouraged, in fact, with a huge amount of resources were put into making the Pacific War a race war. The fantastic book by a guy called John Dower about what he describes as the race war in the Pacific. So, you know, you had at West Virginia, a small town in West Virginia, there's a front page photograph in 1943 of a housewife standing on her porch, and she's holding up 2 ears, Japanese ears, as a trophy that her husband sent her from the Pacific. The post office, the main post office, the branch in San Francisco that dealt with mail coming from the Pacific, would have dried testicles, scalps, ears. It was a daily nightmare sorting through the mail coming back from the Pacific from GIs, sending mementos back to their wonderful housewife that would stand there on the porch to the local newspaper holding up 2 desiccated Japanese ears. My boy's doing a good job. He's killing Japs, yellow monkeys, as they were described, or depicted in propaganda posters all through this country. So if you're a Japanese American, and let's not forget the most decorated unit from World War II, the most decorated, and I would say by far, when you look at it in terms of numbers, is the 442nd Infantry Regiment that fought in Italy, not on Saipan, not on Iwo Jima, not on Okinawa, in Italy, 442nd, Japanese Americans. This guy, first Medal of Honor recipient, his parents were in an internment camp in California. So when they learned of his death, they had to mourn him and have the memorial service in the internment camp. Your son has given his life to defeat virulent racism a long way from home, and you can't even mourn him properly. So I'm coming to the end now, but I just wanted to mention this Harry Kazarian, just because I wanted to emphasize or underline yet again just how diverse this racial quilt of Americans who fought in World War II was. So he's an Armenian American, and there were over 19,000 so-called Armenian Americans that fought in World War II. And he is the most decorated soldier from Rhode Island. So he won more medals or earned more medals rather. I don't like the term won. I don't think you win any medal. I think you earn it. And he received I think it's the DSC on the 11th of June, 1945 in the Pacific and Okinawa. I love those guys' uniforms from Okinawa. So this is my ugly mug here. This is taken in April just this year, just to show you how, this story of World War II is not dead. There's still guys and women alive from World War II and there are some that still wake up every night and have nightmares. And there are some that the war will always define them. It's in their heart, at the core of who they have been ever since. It made them. It shaped their entire view of what it was to be an American, what it was to be a human being, what it was to be a father, a husband. And this is Remigo Kabakama, again, my horrible English accent. He joined the US Navy, age 16. He served in World War II and Korea, and his father survived. You may have heard of the murderous Bataan Death March. And he was at the World War II Memorial, and I went to meet him. It was great to shake his hand. But the point is that he was with a bunch of Filipino Americans. And until the 1980s, 360,000 Filipinos served in the US military in World War II. 360,000. Till the 1980s, they didn't have full benefits as other American citizens had. It took until the 1980s before we took Filipinos and gave them the same pension, gave them the same benefits as other Americans, so-called Americans. So I'm going to end now, and I just wanted to show you a poster for the WWII campaign in World War II. And this was all about winning the war against fascism abroad, but also gaining something at home, true democracy, true equality, if that's ever possible. But certainly aiming for a double victory. If we're going to give this, we want something back. We'd like to be able to vote, for example. We've allowed former Nazis, some of them not even rehabilitated, we've allowed tens and tens of thousands of blue-eyed, blonde-haired Nazis to be able to vote. We liberated them from themselves. We liberated them from the Nazis they elected. We liberated the genocidists from the people that told them to go and kill millions. And yet we come home and we can't vote. So I believe fundamentally that what happened in terms of, and we're going back to the theme of character as destiny, what happened in World War II was a seismic shock to American society. Women felt truly liberated and empowered for the first time in all different ways. Over 360,000 American women from different backgrounds and races served in uniform in World War II. There was no going back. as Julia Parsons said to me, I was wearing a wave uniform, breaking codes, sinking U-boats, and then suddenly I had to go back and cook dinner for my husband in the kitchen. I didn't like that at all. It really upset me. I was not going to spend the rest of my life doing that. And that was the same for many other women. They had seen, if you like, they'd seen the promised land. They'd lived in the promised land. Even if it was 18 hours a day in Washington State building B-17 bombers, it still felt a hell of a lot better than being enslaved in a kitchen. When you look at, in particular, the African-American experience, you have to say that those guys that served in that tank unit that were fighting in tanks through Germany in the spring of 1945, that they came home and they were absolutely, if they hadn't been determined to break down racism and segregation, they were absolutely determined to do it when they came home. We're not talking about hundreds and hundreds of thousands, but it only took a few people here and there with that fervent belief that they were actually going to gain something from this. That why should they have given everything and seen other people give everything and not come back and have some form of legal equality? The fact that it took to 1964, 65 is, to me, I guess it's not that astonishing, but it is disgusting. It's a national tragedy. So I think that women were empowered and liberated. Various minorities felt incredibly proud to serve and came back and became different kinds of Americans. And finally, my point is that when I asked Harry Stewart about his patriotism, he said that it was the first time that I actually felt like I had a part ownership. So that, he's a Black American. It's the first time I felt I had some ownership of my country, that I was valuable, that it was my country. So many communities, Native Americans, Italian Americans, Japanese Americans, I've mentioned many, they were not just fighting for the United States. They were fighting for their own community and their own sense of pride in their community and their neighbors and their friends. If you came from an Indian reservation, and it was a reservation, if you came from a ghetto, if you came from the barrio, you're not fighting for a WASP in Rhode Island. You're fighting for your family and your neighbors and your way of life that you know as an American. That America is what you're fighting for. That is what they called my America. I'm fighting for my family, my community. And that fight was particularly potent and powerful if you were prejudiced against, if you lacked basic civil rights, because you realized that the America that you were fighting for was one that needed to change, and fast. So desegregation of the US military in 1948, it wasn't about some act of generosity. Truman didn't sit there and say, oh, you know what, you've done a good job, thank you very much, we're not gonna have desegregation in the US military. He didn't have any choice. There was no choice. The US military wouldn't have functioned properly. It couldn't function without desegregation. And he knew, he'd been particularly moved and influenced, Truman, by the massive outbreak of racism that occurred in the United States, in the South, particularly after World War II. The Jim Crow crackers were more scared of empowered, educated, smart, young, aggressive, liberated Black Americans coming back to the South and going, you know what, game's over, there's another war going to happen now. They were terrified. And they had every reason to be, because they knew that things were going to have to change. And that's why you had this really, really disturbing reaction against Black GIs coming back. Black GIs in my country, there were race riots in England because caused by the fact that Black GIs, English girls loved them. They were cool. They'd never met. They had great music. They danced really well. They were like, they were really sweet. They were really nice. And English girls dated Black guys all the time. White GIs in the UK, like, what the hell? Oh my God, that cute girl, she's dating that. What the hell? And they'd be in the same bar together. They'd be in the same dance clubs, etc. And there were race riots in Britain because of that, because English girls liked Black GIs. So those guys come back They've been in a nightclub in Piccadilly. They've fought, they've received the Medal of Honor. They've fought across Europe. They've liberated countless millions, and they come back to the US and like suddenly they're second-class citizens. Like, excuse me, I had a really good time over there. That was cool. Even though I was being shot at all the time. It was better than this. And then you look into the fear, the anxiety in the South in particular of white power elites worried about what's going to happen because they're in the minority. You know, let's not let, we can't let them vote. Can't let them, you know, they must never be able to vote. So I think this notion of fighting for my America boils down to this, the idea that there are many Americas. My idea of America is very different to your idea of America, etc. But it's also quintessentially American. That out of this really catastrophic, terribly traumatizing experience, so many millions of Americans were fundamentally changed. And they were fundamentally changed because they looked at other Americans in a different way. They had experienced something that was so uniting and communal and so incredibly effective in breaking down divisions to a certain extent that it changed their fundamental attitudes to what it was to be an American and what it was to allow other Americans to fully realize citizenship and civil rights, etc. I think it's just from that point of view, if you were female, a minority, disadvantaged in many ways, and certainly a victim of institutional legalized prejudice, World War II was a very, very good thing. It was a very powerful accelerator for social change in so many different ways. It's a shame that we have to go to war and then once lose everything to be able to really change society powerfully in that way. But one of the great pluses of that experience, if you survived, if you were not one of the 400,000 who were killed, is that you came back to America that, whether it liked it or not, was going to have to change and did change. So thank you very much for listening to me. It's been really fun. Ooh. I think I only have like 3 minutes, Holly, don't I? So if you have any questions, yeah.
The many people who received the Medal of Honor, and some of them would have received it immediately. Were there any people who maybe had that Medal of Honor delayed because they were from an oppressed or marginalized community?
Yeah, there are lots of examples. Yeah, I mean the 442nd Japanese American unit, they had to wait over 40 years. So they were not in 1945 seen as being the most decorated. It was when President Clinton corrected that. I think he awarded, I think it was 10 Medal of Honors. So that's when they suddenly they got to the top of the list. So yes, it's a very good question, because in the case of certainly African Americans, certainly Japanese Americans, there was a lot of prejudice at the time. You know, you had to have senior officers and eyewitnesses make reports so that you could receive the Medal of Honor. It was quite a laborious process. It's very easy at any stage of that process to go, oh, you know, not the right race, therefore. Yeah, it's a very good question. Yeah, there was even in, what I'm basically saying is that even in during the Second World War, there was prejudice and racism within the award system, and that was corrected. And Clinton did a lot of it in the 90s. But the fact that it took that long, and obviously, you know, I think of the Japanese Americans that received belated awards, that hardly any of them were still alive, which is one of the sad things, you know, that it's after they've passed away that they're finally recognized. But there has been, I think, a very commendable effort in the last 2 or 3 decades to make sure that these groups are recognized. And I don't think it's just about tokenism. I think it's genuinely, after several decades, it was time to go, okay, here's the evidence. Everyone agrees. Everybody within the US military agrees. We need to recognize these guys. We need to correct a wrong, you know? So, yeah. Oh, yeah. You don't want to get me started about renaming things. All I'll say that as history teachers, when I used to go to Richmond, I would go down, is it Monument Road? And I'm like, that was an awesome lesson in the Civil War. That was like, 20 minutes in a car and you'd see the Civil War. But then I thought, oh my God, well, a lot of these monuments were erected after the Civil War as a reminder that, oh, by the way, guess what? You're going to be under the thumb, under the boot. It was a re-infliction of oppression. But at the same time, I'm a bit ambiguous about just getting rid of monuments. And so, for example, I was in Germany about a month ago, and I'd like to still see statues of Hitler everywhere. That's my personal point of view. I'd like the Germans to be constantly reminded, wherever they look, that there was a guy called Hitler. I'd like them to be reminded of the fact that that guy carried out the Holocaust. So it's gets murky when you talk about erasing history, Yeah.
Have you ever experienced with how the culture, including minority members in the military, just the patriotism and the propaganda was out, or was the saving from your lifestyle being downtrodden?
That's a really good question. With the Tuskegee Airmen, there were really fantastic recruiting posters that you can find. You go and Google them. So that was kind of like, it was a really sexy, cool propaganda campaign to try and recruit people into that unit. But that comes back to the point, which is like, what were the influences that were the most effective in terms of changing institutions? So I would say that the Great Migration from the South to the Midwest to Washington State to work in the war industries to produce tanks and planes, etc. That was a massive social change in the US. You had this second great movement of people from the South going to work in factories, etc. Their wages, American wages doubled during World War II. And it was it was an economic miracle. The middle class literally was created by World War II. So you come back to this question of like, oh, did we really care about them, or were they useful? And Black Americans were incredibly useful, and women were also absolutely essential to winning the war, because we needed someone to build the tanks and the airplanes. So it's double-edged, And I think that also when you think about some of these groups, like the Chicanos I showed you, the National Guard unit, all those guys were able to feed their families when they were in the National Guard. The Bedford Boys, and that is as rural and white as you can get in rural Virginia in the 1930s. They were joining, because they were patriotic, but more importantly, they got $1 a week for attending a drill practice. My point is that economic necessity fueled some of the so-called patriotism. Yeah, they were very happy to wear a uniform because they could feed their families. They were very happy to go and work in a factory in Chicago or Seattle because they actually could live a decent life for the first time. But economic opportunity also fueled the so-called pride of wearing the uniform or serving your country because you could actually put food on the table. So we have to mix that factor into why suddenly everyone was super patriotic. It's because, well, I don't mind. I can feed the kids, Anyway, I will end now because we're going to overlap into the next.
And I appreciate it. Thank you very much for the opportunity to present and speak. This is the third time that I've done it. Welcome to those of you on Zoom. Many of us teachers are familiar with Zoom. And I taught on it for almost a year and a half exclusively. So thank you for being here. Thank you. I wanted to start by telling you the topic that I'm doing is dealing with ways that you can incorporate media literacy, and some examples that I'm going to provide of things that kids could research in their local area, in their neighborhoods about World War II. And so I teach at Mayfield High School, Las Cruces, New Mexico. I'm also, there's an organization, I don't know if anybody familiar with the News Literacy Project. And so we have started to implement and use it a lot in our district. And media literacy is an important part of the New Mexico standards. And so it's something that you could incorporate and the kids should be aware of and the kids should be literate in order to research. And I look at it very differently. I put on purpose here a picture of print newspapers because when I became a high school teacher, it was before the internet. And we use print newspapers as a main source of media exclusively. And I still do to this day, get every day delivered to my school 35 copies of the Albuquerque Journal that we use. So we use print and internet. So I use that picture specifically for something. And one of the things that's important is why, and I looked at the theme that was chosen, character and destiny. So why is it so important when you're talking about even research and media literacy, giving kids some background, et cetera? Why is it important? So for me, and this morning, Alex asked us about World War II and what's important to us, et cetera. So I think as educators, we should always keep alive the history and impact of World War II in our classrooms, keeping in mind generational change, okay? So I'll use me as an example when we talk about World War II. When I grew up, there were World War II vets all over. Okay, my grandfather served in World War II. I had teachers who were World War II veterans, neighbors who were World War II veterans. So it was just there. And it was nothing that I thought of, but I grew up, I was born in 1959. So I'm aging myself for you. I'm 64 years old. So I was used to it. It was there. But we need to keep it alive. And last year, when at the beginning of the school year, not last year, the year before last, on the first day of school, a student asked me, he goes, I teach government and AP government, and I teach about World War II and government too. And he asked me, he goes, so what do you think is the most important thing? What do you like teaching about? Am I live, Max? Okay, yeah, okay, I think I pushed it and then pushed it, so I'm there. And he asked me, what is important? And I said, I think it's important we understand the contributions and we research the contributions of what happened during World War II. And he goes, oh, why that? And I said, because in my lifetime, from what I know, from what my father told me, from what my grandmother told me, from what my grandfather told me, from what my teachers told me, it was like the only time in modern history that we can think of where everyone in this country contributed and everybody built character and everybody did something post and was affected by it. Today, we're fortunate in this country is if we go into military conflicts and things like that, we have a volunteer and a professional military. In World War II, when you think about it, was like everybody was serving. I did a presentation during COVID on our virtual one on the Bracero program, and the impact in the area where I lived was they were short of farm workers because everybody went to go serve in the military. So they had to bring in workers from Mexico. So everybody was involved in some way or another. Character destiny includes for kids to research those who served, those who provided support, and those who were impacted. And I think that's really important to keep in mind. And I'll show you a couple examples of what I mean by that. Media literacy education provides a tool for students to accurately research, understand information, research, discussing and talking about World War II. And there's a lot of examples in our communities for students to research, ask questions, and understand post character. So one of the things that I'm going to show you is a tool on media literacy from the News Literacy Project. First of all, it's important that kids understand that they have a right to be literate, to know what's right, what's wrong in the media, misinformation, disinformation, etc. And so just one of the things I go over with kids is that information is basic for civic literacy, agency, and action. For kids to take ownership in what they learn, to be able to be comfortable and confident that what they're hearing, reading, seeing in any form of media, because media is print, social, internet, hearing, listening, everything, that they are able to understand they can take ownership, take action. Students are inheriting the largest and most complex information landscape in human history. Oh my God, we all know that. Everything that we see, that we hear, especially with the internet, okay? I can remember the first day that we used the internet in the classroom. It was unbelievable that what the kids were going and looking and what they were finding. Not preparing them to successfully navigate and play a role in shaping this landscape is unfair. We need to ensure that our kids understand the different aspects of media literacy and they understand the role of the First Amendment. All right, so a basic definition that you could share with your kids, media literacy is the ability to access, to go out and find, to look, analyze, evaluate, create, and act using all forms of communication, okay? And we're all aware of what those are, and it's the foundation of civics education, media literacy. Some of the teachable skills that are important when we're going to it is, first of all, as I said, the First Amendment. Understanding the watchdog role of journalists. So when we talk about media literacy with kids, it's important for them to understand that the First Amendment allows for journalists to look at things for us, to try and tell us. And we need to have some basic trust that what we're getting is the truth. And looking at our government, our society, everything. And to identify the four main elements of press freedom. I put in here, included for you all, a little visual that maybe you could use on the First Amendment, or I'm not going to go over it in detail, but we're all familiar. This is something that I go over with kids, the purposes of information, so they understand the differences when they're researching media literacy. First of all, the hardcore news, what's reporting, what's happening, that they can distinguish from news opinion, okay? And opinion is okay. Opinion's good, okay? And we see a lot of it today in our media, and we need to be able to distinguish it. Propaganda. One of the things, and I've noticed this when I've gone through with kids, one of the big interests, of course, with World War II is propaganda during World War II. And that's a form of media. And it's important to understand, for kids to be media literacy, to understand how maybe even the media was involved in propaganda during war, especially during World War II. And I think Alex gave a good example with race and the Japanese during World War II and the role of the media in that. There's a lot of stuff to research in that. I'm going to show you a picture in a minute to give you an idea. Entertainment. The entertainment, that's media, okay? They're on strike now, I think. But that's entertainment is part of the media. Advertising. When I start off the year and I have kids discuss current events, whether I have them do it on the internet or the print, I'll always get a kid who will come up with an ad from Dillard's or something as their example of media. But it's part of the media, but we got to understand where it plays. And then raw information, just what kids hear and see. For better or for worse, kids are going to get their raw information today from things like TikTok, the Snapchat, different things like that. Okay, so that's That's all there. Just to, I wanted to give you an example from the News Literacy Project, something you can do in your classroom. They have a function that I use called Checkology. It's going under maintenance right now for July for ready for the school year. But Checkology is a tool where you could do go over media literacy. It has a pre-quiz on media literacy, and it has a number of lessons on anything from First Amendment, what is news, what is propaganda. Great one, editorial cartoon, where they use a lot of World War II cartoons in it. And you can use it in your classroom, has a group activity, a cooperative learning activity, an individual activity with a lot of examples. And you can go in there and you can create your own classroom, or you can pick pieces from it and use it as pieces. And if you go to NLP, you can create an account, and the feature is called Technology, and it has in it a great First Amendment one that you could start as an introductory and go through it. And included, not just with Checkology, but if you go here, some things you could sign up for a newsletter called the SIF newsletter that gives you a weekly accounting of everything going on in the media. They have a great, for World War II research, the News Literacy Project has this thing called the Archive, where you could just find all kinds of articles, news articles, historical, things like that. They have the use of podcasts, a library. They have a feature called Rumor Guard, where they take news stories and they tell you if they're fact or fiction every week. And one of the things they're getting involved in, and I think it's important to understand this, not for history and for current events, is this new thing of artificial intelligence. Have you guys been getting into that in the classroom? Chat GPT and things like that. Become aware of those things. I'm already in school right now. Our calendar is very strange. And the other day, our department had to write a SMART goal. Chat GPT wrote it for me. And so, yep, I did what kids did. So the News Literacy Project has a lot of things you can do to use in the classroom for media literacy. So go through it. What I want you to do, this is one of the activities uses the role of editorial cartoonist and the power of art. This is the lesson in Checkology in particular that deals a lot with the Second World War. So I encourage you to go to Checkology and look at it and see how you can maybe apply it in your classroom. All right, so let's talk a little bit about media and just some basic things in World War II that I've learned over time and what I talk about. So one of the entertainment industry's media. It's a fact. They use the current events of the time on how we have looked at World War II. And I'm giving you examples also how it's been presented, even me growing up. So one of the things that when I was in graduate school, I took a course on American history post-World War II, okay? And at that time, it would have been into the 80s. And one of the first things the professor emphasized to us was right after World War II, the way that the country was introduced to how we look at vets, and it's very broad, was this film that was an Academy Award-winning film. Have any of you seen this film? And it depicts and shows the returning veterans and what they were dealing with. And one of the things that a lot of people have talked about with World War II vets is how silent they were when they came back. And the best years of our lives, which I've seen a number of times, it showed in families. Hollywood was trying to depict the role of veterans and the experiences they are. So I encourage you to look. So late 1940s, Americans were looking at this film. And of course, the film was Hollywood, but there's a lot of in this film, there's a lot of depictions that are pretty accurate in what they do. Then going through to look at how entertainment and the media and what kids might find if they research World War II. Of course, political cartoons. Okay, this is the depiction of Iwo Jima, Happy Veterans Day. But in the 1950s, if we're looking at what was going on in the media, does anybody know who this is? The Beaver, yeah, Beaver. Okay, the 1950s, I think Americans were trying to think of, let's get on with our lives. The country was booming, okay? People were buying their homes, their cars, etc. So things were things were going, and the media was looking at things like that. World War II vets were the big part of contribution of doing things. Then we turn to the 60s. The 60s in this country, of course, were very divisive. We know that because of race and war in this country. And then on the networks, they put a TV show on that probably would never be on the TV today. Yeah, no way. What, you guys familiar with how the media presented in the 60s? Hogan's Heroes, which I still watch on TV all the time. It was on when I was a kid, a comedy show, okay? And a group of American prisoners who were a special unit in a German POW camp. And one of my links, I'll show you an example of something in a minute. So the media the country was looking at things different, okay? Like I said, there's no way that today through the media, through entertainment, that a show like Hogan's Heroes could be on TV. I just can't imagine that, okay? Then in the 70s, which to me were my formative years, I graduated from high school in 1977, the country was divisive, and then World War II vets were starting to get older, and then what show was on TV? Yeah, this All in the Family, the media was portraying, Archie Bunker, the bigot, right? Oops, I'm sorry, I'm going through this. Archie Bunker was viewed by some as the bigot, or for some as the hero, okay? And could this show be on TV today? No way, absolutely no way. This is how media changes and things. But it just shows how our country over time, and the media is very representative of that, and a lot of it's done through entertainment. So kids need to be aware of how we've changed post-World War II. Then we get into the 80s, the age of Reagan, the 90s. And I think what's changed in the 90s with media and everything, of course, was the advent of the internet and instant information. Boy, that just changed everything, okay? Right before BC, before COVID, in my district, we had a ransomware attack. And one morning in that fall semester, the internet went down. And everybody in the hallway was like, oh my God. And we didn't have internet for 3 months because of the ransomware attack. And then I realized I was like the only person in my department who was used to not having the internet. And so be aware of the power of the internet. All right. So I thought I'd give you some examples of things that I would do in the classroom. Up here. Just some brief examples of when you have kids research, use the media to look at World War II, some things that they could do. You know what, Max? I'm not used to a mouse. I was using a mouse. All right. These should just click, shouldn't they? Okay. So I just hit it. Okay, there we go. All right, so one of the first sources in media, always good to look at, is to go to the Library of Congress. I have kids go there for media literacy, and they go by time. And so we have, if you go back up here. There we go. So they have a great section post-war, the United States, of course, they have the Depression, World War II, But here, kids can do a lot of research of World War II and character post-World War II. Great examples. And so that's one that I use there. All right, let me get back. Sorry for being a little clunky on this. All right, another great source that I have found for kids to research World War II past media is the National Park Service. Isn't there somebody here from the National Park Service? Ah, excellent. Yeah, there we go. Very good source. Okay. Excellent source. Let me get back here. Click. All right. I found one of the things that we've talked about. So, and when my father passed away, I was cleaning out a dresser drawer, and I found these World War II rationing coupon books. And my father was in high school in World War II because his father was in the Army. And my dad's name was on them. And so then I realized he would go buy the groceries because my grandmother worked. And he had all these rationing coupon books that were unused. And then I thought, wow, the sacrifice. And I even realized that we were rationing still with some things after World War II in this country. And I'm going to show you something later that'll show you some examples of that. But I think the last big rationing project in World War II that went into 46, maybe 47, was sugar. Okay, to do with sugar. So there's a lot of private sites, company sites where kids can research. And this is an example that I'm just giving you there. Let me get, there we go. And then, of course, using the archives of, there we go. From the New York Times. Oh, why is this article not popping up? This is an archive story about an individual who talked about rationing and pork and the price of pork. And I thought this was done in the 70s, and the pork was $1.99 a pound then, and that was during inflation. Pork, I think, is a lot more now. So you can do a lot of things looking at stories like that. Let me get to the next one. All right, I found here this one. The Khan Academy is a great source for kids to research World War II. Alex talked about the GI Bill, and they have a great tool on the GI Bill post World War II adjustment. Whoa, there we go. Khan Academy. There we go. And they have an overview that kids can go through the World War II GI Bill and the effects into the 50s. And they have all about the baby boomers, African Americans, great media tool that could be used. Then, I think I went too far. There's a great tool I found for media literacy on the readjustment of the American soldier coming back from World War II at AmericanSoldierWorldWar2.org. Has anybody ever gone through this? There's a lot of great resources. So it's there in the link you have in the PowerPoint on your thumb drive. The archives, this is on the Readjustment Act. The National Archives has a lot of great stories. One of the things that I found is interesting, a number of years ago, we asked for a copy of my grandfather's service record. And when individuals research service records, and we found out that in 1978, there was a fire in St. Louis of a National Archives record center where a lot of the records of World War II vets were held. And it destroyed a lot of the records. And they sent back my grandfather's, and you could barely read it because it was affected by the fire. And that's all that was left for a lot of vets from World War II. And so when you're researching and requesting things from them, if the record was in that archive center, a lot of it is damaged or destroyed. And so I thought that was interesting. You could barely read his service record. All right, let me get in there. And then, of course, the Smithsonian. I thought this was an interesting thing the kids could look at in researching. I found this was amazing. The paralyzed World War II vets who invented wheelchair basketball. I didn't know about this. And when I read this article, and I thought, wow, what a great thing in the media that kids could research about wheelchair basketball. Was anybody aware of this? The links there. This is a great story. And there's an ad for Kaiser Permanente. Oh, that was appropriate. All right. Okay. All right. How am I doing on time? Okay. I found some great resources. The census, of course, gives a lot of information on data information. Is it going there? On those who served. They have everything on vets from World War II to the War on Terror. And so the census is a great source of information. Some of Presidents Kennedy and Presidents Nixon, of course Eisenhower was, and they were World War II vets. And at their library websites, I chose one from the JFK library. They have a lot of good information on World War II and post-World War II at their websites. And the Reagan Library does also. And so that's a good source that you can look at. Then one of the things in researching media in World War II I think is important is opinion is important. And just recently, is anybody familiar with Victor Davis Hanson? He's an opinion person, but he on D-Day wrote a real good column about remembering the horrors of D-Day and how it's important. Should I make Chrome faster? I'm sorry, Max, I don't want to mess up your Chrome. This thing popped up all of a sudden. The importance of Americans remembering what happened on D-Day. And it's his viewpoint, and he wrote, but as part of media literacy, it's important to research things like this and for kids to understand that this is Victor Davis Hanson's viewpoint, but it's based on fact and it's important. Okay. So these are just examples from the media that not get down here. I'm going to click this off because I'm going to open it up more. Okay, great. All right. One of the things local I thought is important that you can understand. I live in New Mexico. There's at the archives great articles about the Navajo code talkers. I also want to point out there were code talkers from other tribes in New Mexico and Arizona and Utah. Okay, there were code talkers from all over. There's thank you, Max, for pointing out the three because one just died recently. There were four, and if you go, has anybody ever been to Window Rock, where you mentioned they have that great memorial there on the Navajo Nation, and the New Mexico legislature, I think they passed a bill recently to start building actually a code talkers museum on the Navajo Nation on the New Mexico side to put through. So when kids locally research, if I have kids locally research in New Mexico, the code talkers is an important part of our curriculum. When I was growing up, there were veterans who lived in my community who were survivors of the Bataan Death March. That's another thing where I live that there were a number of. When we talk about character and individuals affected by World War II, I want to open this. It wasn't just those who in the military. Oh, come on, open up. When I was growing up, did it open? Oh, cool. When I was growing up, there was a store in the local mall where I lived in Las Cruces in the Laredo Mall. And there was a men's store where me, my dad, my brothers, we went regularly, bought jeans, clothes, etc. And it was run by a couple named the Colemans. Miss Coleman worked there, salesman, spoke with a heavy, thick Eastern European accent. We just know her, Mrs. Coleman and Mr. Coleman, Irving, very nice couple, etc. Miss Coleman had a tattoo here. And growing up, we really never realized or thought about it. She's no longer alive, but at the El Paso Holocaust Museum, there's an interview with her, and she was a Holocaust survivor. And she became a refugee, came to Las Cruces, El Paso and Las Cruces, married a man there. And then I began growing up realizing there were a number of across our country, of course, of the Holocaust survivors. But I think it's important that kids, as part of literacy, media literacy, and post-World War II, those affected by it, that they also conduct research in those who survived the Holocaust and were impacted by the Holocaust, because they're an important part of the Second World War. And so growing up, I didn't even think about it. And then after I think, wow, look at what Miss Coleman survived, and we knew her very well. All right. And then when researching, let me pull it up. I'm sorry for being a little clunky. One of the things that the kids can research are oral histories. And I found just locally where kids can research in my community, there are a number of Japanese farmers in my community. In fact, my neighbor, when I was growing up, their name was Tashido. And they were important farmers in the Mesilla Valley. And there was another one, the Nakayama family. And during World War II, if you research some of these families, some of them were not sent to the internment camps because of their importance to agriculture. The Nakayama family is important product in my community, green chili. And one of my neighbors, when I was going through and researching, actually stayed because of because of agriculture. So they could find out a lot about the local, when they're researching at local museums, local things. Another source of media, not a positive source, and I put two in here, is obituaries. Sometimes we only find out about those who served in war, especially World War II, is through obituary. And I pulled this one up for two reasons, and I'll show you in a minute. This was a friend of mine. And he, after the war, became a civilian employee at White Sands Missile Range, White Sands Proving Ground, spent his career there. He never really talked a lot about the war. I worked with his wife, and he had on his license plate of his vehicle, World War II POW. He was a POW. He served, then he came back, he was a civilian employee. Simple life, but his history is, and kids can find history of World War II. That's an important part of media. Obituaries are an important part of that. Another example of an obituary that let me pull it up, that I found here. Boom. This gentleman just died recently, World War II vet. And his son put in there, his name was Charlie Gonzalez, Carlos, Charlie. And he put in here very simple about what he did, his son put in the obituary. He saw action at Normandy and Bastogne, and a good source of research. However, one of the things that, and the YouTube videos that, oh, what happened to YouTube? Oh, well, there's a link in the PowerPoint, and it should work, right, Max? The link. Yeah, it's not popping up here for some reason, but I put the link. So about 4 years ago, his son, I know his son, and his son said that his dad was in World War II, never really talked about it except with him. So I said, can he come talk to one of my classes? And he said, I'll ask him. And he said, okay, I will. And we filmed it. He came to one of my class after lunch, and the first thing I was afraid of, oh, these kids are going to be late. But he presented and he started talking about it. It was very emotional for him because he never talked in front of students or anybody except with his son. And we found out he was in the 10th wave of Normandy. He was a medic, but he was a medic, he said, that carried a weapon. And so he was in combat, and he was in the Battle of the Bulge. All these things he just started telling us. We were asking him questions, and he was very emotional. He was talking about war, and he was telling us he hopes that nobody ever goes to war. He joined when he was 17. So it was the first time that Charlie had ever really talked about the war with anybody besides his son. And we got it all on video. And I put it on YouTube. To share. And so the link is there. I think it's an interesting conversation. And one thing that's important when you bring in some, if you could, how many World War II vets are still alive? 130,000. So I encourage you, if you can ever bring one into the classroom, to do it. My students were the age that he was when he went into war. They were 17 and 18. They were seniors, and after it was over, we were talking, and they were saying they couldn't just imagine themselves being in those situations, and that's how much it's changed. All right. One of the other things that I thought was interesting in local research is two things of interest. I live near White Sands Missile Range. And these are right here, some links that I'm not going to go to them. I'm going to talk about them briefly if I have a chance to go to them. And I'm show you some pictures. Oops, I'm going a little bit too far. Let me go back. Did I mess this up? Oh, that's why. Okay, I'm going to go right back up here. Excuse me. There. All right. So one of the things that's interesting is, have you all ever heard of this Operation Paperclip? Something that when you talk about it with kids, they're going like, what? Then I realized, and I've had my kids to go to research two things that happened. I'm going to go to this next one here first. There. I'm going to go back up, and then I'll go to the other one. Talking about post-World War II and the impact of it. So White Sands Missile Range is just 15, 20 minutes from where I live. It's on the other side of the mountain. It's post-World War II. It's, of course, where the rockets and missiles were developed. These Nazi scientists that were in the SS were brought over to the United States. They had developed what Dr. von Braun was the head of the team, and they had developed the V2. They would start in Germany, start developing the V2 rocket, and they came to White Sands and Fort Bliss, and the whole team, and to develop our rocket and our missile program, White Sands Missile Range. And what got me thinking about it is my friend Bob Bowden, he spent his career working at White Sands where there were Nazi scientists working, and he was a POW during that time. I thought, man, I never even asked Bob about that. What did he think? And so that's my timer. It's going towards the end. So I include in here some pictures, some things that locally my students could research. We never realized the V2 rockets and that Dr. von Braun was building in Germany. The American Army disassembled everything from his lab, and they arrived by a train station that I drive by every day in Las Cruces. And then they took them to White Sands. So there's V2 rocket there. This is at White Sands is Dr. von Braun was, of course, a member of the SS, a Nazi scientist, captured, brought over, developed the missile program, the rocket program, then NASA. and was, I believe, the first director of NASA. And you were talking about name changes. There was an editorial recently in the New York Times, and I read it because we changed one of the names of the high schools in my school district. It was called Oñate High School, and Oñate was a very brutal man. And today it's called Organ Mountain High School, and they changed the name of it because of that. And there was an editorial in the New York Times. Some of the buildings at some of the NASA research sites are named after some of the scientists who were in the SS, and they've never been touched, the names. And I don't want to get in the controversy of the name changing, but I remember reading the editorial. But there's a plane when you enter White Sands Missile Range at the museum, and it's Dr. von Braun's plane that he flew between White Sands and Alabama when he was transitioning from the missiles and the rockets to space. And that was his planes right there. He flew it to Alabama back from White Sands. There was a picture there. This is talking about kids researching local things. When I was growing up, this is Clyde Tombaugh. Does anybody know who Clyde Tombaugh is? He discovered Pluto. He was my neighbor. And he, during World War II, trained aviators in Flagstaff in Arizona. Then he became a scientist at White Sands, and then a professor at New Mexico State University, an astronomy professor. And his pictures there in White Sands, very simple. There's different stories that I've included pictures you can look at. There's that V2 rocket of Dr. von Braun's that's there, etc. Also, and I have a handout. The other thing I was going to talk about doing research. I was an undergraduate student at New Mexico State University, and when I was an undergraduate, the yearbook, all students were entitled to get a yearbook every year. It's called the swastika. Yeah, I have the last one, and the swastika was originally a symbol of peace and good luck and good fortune, Hindu, and used by some of the Southwestern American tribes, the Zuni, the Navajo, etc. And in 1907, 1908 school year, it became the name of the yearbook at New Mexico State University. And by 1983, there were many student votes during the time whether or not to keep it. It always won. We're going to keep the name swastika. And the president of the university at the time, when I was an undergraduate, I knew Dr. Thomas was a World War II vet, a fighter pilot, etc. And he wrote an article in the Southern New Mexico Historical Review talking about his time as president and getting rid of, when the Board of Regents finally said, we're going to get rid of this name, because a lot of members of the Jewish community in Las Cruces, New Mexico, were saying, hey, this has to stop. And when I was an undergraduate, and the swastika, maybe I'm the Hogan's Heroes generation, it just was in my mind, but it was something that, oh, okay, but it didn't bother me. I have them on my bookcase still, all the yearbooks, and they're all there. But finally, by 83, it was a symbol. The article's really good, something that a piece of media, and I have copies of it that I'll give you there at the end. And so, one of the things that I think is important is I still, when we talk about World War II, I still have some students who have some grandparents or great-grandparents that are still alive that were very young and served in World War II. Very rare, but I still do. And I wanted to show you when you talk about character and destiny. So this is a little personal thing. So am I hitting it right, Max? Right here? Ah. Boom. So one of the things that I encourage you to do is to have kids to look and see if there's anything that they have in family archives or family treasures about World War II. So this is something that was like very interesting to our family. About 10, 12 years ago, a cousin of mine in Albuquerque was going through his grandfather, who's my uncle's, things, and he found a bunch of old videos. And one of the videos he found was my grandfather coming back from World War II. My grandfather served in the army in World War II. And when the war ended in 1945, he was in the army in Germany. He stayed another year and he came back from Germany in April of 1946. And one of the things about people, so if I hit it, I play it. So this is my grandfather. My cousin made it. The only survivor left in the video is my aunt. And this is, when we looked at it, we're going like, whoa, that's my grandfather. He just arrived at Fort Bliss, then came up. He is. That old man right here is my great-grandfather, who he was a congressman in New Mexico right after statehood, and he was retired. And during the war, he came back to service. He served on the draft board for New Mexico, which was a very difficult position in states to serve on the draft board. That's why probably my grandfather, his son-in-law, served in the war. That was my dad, who was a senior in high school, my grandmother, my aunt, and my uncle. That's one of my uncle. They're all my aunts and uncles, my grandfather's sisters coming back. And one of the things about the video, first when we got it, we're like, wow, this is sort of different. Where is it? So then we learned that that's my grandparents, my grandmother, my grandfather. We learned that my family was divided between Albuquerque and Santa Fe. And in between Albuquerque and Santa Fe, there's a town called Bernalillo. So during the war, whenever they had a family gathering, they would have it in Bernalillo. That's all his sisters, because you couldn't get new tires on your cars. You had gas rationing. You couldn't buy new cars. So everybody would meet in the middle. And it was still that way in 46. And so this was the meeting of them. And when he was arriving, and a lost video that we, thank God, found, and there he was. So this is just a little bit of personal thing. I thought I'd end it where kids can find personal history and looking for videos. That's my aunt. All right, I will end it there, and everything's included in the video. Any comments or questions on the role of media in World War II, what you can do on the tool that I showed you? Good.
There's so much available to us now. How do you have your students kind of fine tune everything and sort through what's the most impactful information they're down?
So I think it's what they're looking at, what they're researching. If they're going to try and find something local, I try and guide them towards local museums, local historical societies, obituaries of local, etc. If it's national, some of these other sites like the archives or Library of Congress, National Park Service, I guide them for that. And then I was really glad that at some of these presidential libraries, the presidents who served in World War II, they have a lot. Nixon, Reagan, Kennedy, Eisenhower, a lot of stuff there that they're doing that. Comments, questions?
Your students participate in march like scenes?
I have had some students and teachers who do that. You're talking about the baton. Yeah, and it was and part of it was virtual during COVID. That's a big at White Sands. They have every year a big memorial march that the armies, oh my God, units and battalions come from all over the world, and they participate in that huge march for Bataan. Like I said, growing up, I knew survivors of the march. They lived in Las Cruces. I knew their kids. I went to high school with their kids. Yep, exactly. Any other comments, questions? I want to thank you for allowing me to do this. I really thought this was sort of an important tool. I hope it's helpful. Thank you for those of you on Zoom who are listening. And so I appreciate it. Thank you very much. Alex is telling me I'm out of time, so.
My name is Tyler Crafton-Clarens. I formerly worked at the Museum of History and Holocaust Education at Kennesaw State University. We're about 30 minutes, 20 minutes, 30 minutes north of Atlanta. I resigned my position there back in March, and I now operate my family's small business, Plant Daddies of Atlanta. If you have any questions about houseplants, I'm happy to help. But if you also have any questions about World War II, about the Holocaust, that's the museum that I worked at, World War II and the Holocaust. Or if you have any questions about queer history, LGBTQ+ history, I'm more than happy to be a resource for you all and to help you all out. But today we're going to be talking about veterans and sort of veterans of World War II and the fight for LGBTQ+ rights in sort of the 50s and the 60s. And sorry to the cameraman, I like to walk around and be a little bit more interactive. So, but today's big idea, we always used to do like the big idea and the essential questions. I'm sure you all kind of do similar things in your lesson plans. But using their experience in service, lesbian and gay veterans of World War II really played an instrumental role in the formation of early homophile movements here in the United States. And we're going to talk about what those homophile movements are, what that word means in just a little bit. So we're going to talk about why was World War II important, why it was an important event for gay and lesbian veterans in the United States, how those veterans of World War II contributed to the gay rights movement, like I said, in the 50s and 60s. And then we're also going to look at who these gay and lesbian veterans were. Now, just a little bit really quickly about the Museum of History and Holocaust Education. I actually did this presentation year ago, I guess, about a year ago, for a group of homeschool students, which that's a whole different breed in and of itself, right? Bless them. And it was really interesting to hear some of the feedback from them. But I've sort of I redid this presentation for you all, for educators. But we're going to be talking about some of the same people, the same veterans. Now, the Museum of History and Holocaust Education, it is a free museum. Everything that the museum does is free for educators and students. I'll say that again. Everything that they do is free for educators and students. Nobody's from Georgia, right? I don't think so. No, okay. They will do virtual programs with your students, and they'll log on all day with your students and do different programs for you all if you'd like. And again, that's free. They also have teacher's guides with lesson plans already laid out and the resources that you need for those lesson plans. All of that's available as a PDF download online. And then we've also got, or they also have an oral history program, which is really wonderful. So they've interviewed World War II veterans, homefront workers, and Holocaust survivors. And they've cut those, hour-long interviews into short, digestible, 2, 3, 4-minute clips so that your students can understand. And then they've got them all sort of, what's the word I'm trying to look for? They have them all cataloged, and you can click on like different hashtags kind of thing. So if you're looking for Pearl Harbor, right, you can click on Pearl Harbor and you get all the Pearl Harbor videos. You're looking for D-Day, you click on D-Day, you get all the D-Day videos, right? Or all the videos about D-Day. So really awesome resources. And again, it's all free for you guys. So please utilize them. I don't work for them anymore, but I'm more than happy to support them because what they're doing is really fantastic work. But back to today's presentation, we're going to start a little sort of past World War II. We're going to talk about the Stonewall Inn Uprising. This was June 28th through July 3rd, 1969. So we just celebrated the anniversary of this. This was in New York City. You see the picture of the Stonewall Inn here. It was at this bar that gay men, drag queens, and trans women took a stand against police brutality and fought back for their rights. And this was, a lot of people think this was the first instance of gays and lesbians and trans people fighting back for their rights. We're going to see, though, that it wasn't. The Mattachine Society newsletter in July of 1969, after the Stonewall Inn Uprising, said this. It catered largely, talking about the Stonewall Inn, It catered largely to a group of people who are not welcome in or cannot afford other places of homosexual social gathering. The stone wall became home to these kids. When it was raided, they fought for it. That and the fact that they had nothing to lose other than the most tolerant and broad-minded gay place in town explains why. Okay, so a very, very important event in the history of the gay rights movement. However, this was not the first instance, right? To really understand the gay rights movement, we have to go back to World War II. So let's talk about some gays and lesbians in World War II. After the bombing of Pearl Harbor in 1941, America enters the war and men begin joining the military, okay? US military began screening these enlistees for homosexual behavior, for signs of any kind of homosexuality, and they tried to sort of weed those people out, okay? They would do physical examinations, they would ask questions, they had psychiatrists and psychologists asking questions to try to see if somebody was in fact a homosexual. But as the war progressed and they needed more and more soldiers, the US military started to kind of look the other way, right? So they would just say, "Are you gay?" "Nope." "All right, welcome to the military," right? That's kind of how it went after, you know, a certain amount of time, because they really needed soldiers. And so they would kind of look the other way. There were some instances, though, where people were denied military service because there was a fear for their safety, for, you know, the quote unquote safety of others. But again, in sort of those, you know, later years of the war, they just sort of looked the other way. And by the way, don't wait till the end to ask questions. If you have questions now, raise your hand. I'm happy to answer anything. Now, for gays and lesbians in World War II was sort of a national coming out, okay? These men and women are now leaving their small hometowns. They're intermingling with other people of the same gender, and they're finding other people that are like them, okay? So this was a huge moment for them, because now they have people finally that are like them, right? That think like them, that believe in sort of the same things as them. And so this was a huge moment and a huge coming out for a lot of these gay and lesbian Americans. One of these individuals, Johnny Phelps, who you can see pictured here, she was born in 1922. She served in the US Women's Army Corps, the WACS, during World War II. Later on in the 80s, she did an interview, an oral history interview with a historian. And she told this story and we're going to look at this in just a little bit, but this is what she sort of became famous for. She allegedly stood up to Dwight D. Eisenhower regarding lesbians in the military. And we're going to talk about that in just a moment. But after the war was over, she went on to fight for lesbian veterans, okay? Now, this is the quote from that interview. So just a little sort of backstory here. General Eisenhower went to, according to Johnny Phelps, went to her and said, "I want you to, quote unquote, ferret out the lesbians. I want you to find the lesbians and I want you to get them out of the military, out of the Women's Army Corps." Her response was, "Yes, sir. If the general pleases, I will be happy to do this investigation. But sir, it would be unfair of me not to tell you my name is going to head the list. You should also be aware that you're going to have to replace all the file clerks, the section heads, most of the commanders, and the motor pool." To which General Eisenhower responded, "Forget the order." Now, this is from an interview in 1982 with Bunny McCulloch. There's evidence to suggest that this actually never happened. mainly because she was never really around General Eisenhower, or at least when she said this story took place, General Eisenhower was back here in the United States and she was in Europe, or he was in Europe and she was here in the States. It could not really have happened. Okay. Now, do you think that this could have happened? And this is where we're getting into the interactive. I know we've kind of been just like sitting and listening, but we're gonna get interactive with this presentation. So this is a legitimate question. I mean, do you think that this would have happened the way that she says it did? I mean, to be so brazen as to tell the 5-star general of the military, right? The only 5-star general of the military, okay, I can do this, but you're going to have to get rid of me first, right?
Well, I think so. It's 1982, right? So it's.
That's when the interview was.
And so in 1982, she's probably more emboldened than she would have been in 1944. And so obviously gay rights have come a long way from 1944 to 1989. And maybe in 1989, she would have said that to him. Because the movement's come such a long way, but
Right.
maybe not in 1944.
It's also possible over time that it maybe wasn't Eisenhower, could have been another general or colonel, somebody of importance, but she was just recalling it differently because of the time and age.
Or maybe it was somebody from his office working for him, and she said, well, go tell him that I'm gonna be at the first on the list.
Or maybe they could have been talking over the phone.
Okay, yeah, maybe they could have been talking over the phone, absolutely. So, by the way, these are the questions that, because we're going to look at a few different quotes from a few different veterans, and these are questions that you can bring up with your students to talk about and start a conversation. But, if so, how do you think Phelps felt saying this to General Eisenhower and why? And also talk about why do you think she decided to admit her homosexuality to Eisenhower if this did in fact happen? But if it didn't happen, why do you think she believes that it did? So does anybody want to take a stab at any of those?
Given the opportunity, she would have, whether it did happen or not. Maybe
Okay.
she would have.
And I think whether it happened or not, I think the point too is for her to say, this is how prevalent. Like, I wasn't alone then, I'm not alone now, and I want that to be heard.
Anybody else? So I want to bring this up, and this is sort of some side research that I've done as part of my PhD. But there's a psychiatrist by the name of Dory Laub, and he has done a lot of research on Holocaust survivors and Holocaust survivor testimony. And in this one chapter of this book that he co-wrote with Shoshana Fellman, he talks about this instance where he interviewed a Holocaust survivor about the Auschwitz uprising, where the crematorium, one of the crematoriums was blown up. In this interview, she talks about 4 chimneys being blown up in Auschwitz during this event. Few months later, he's showing this interview to a group of people, a group of Holocaust historians and psychiatrists and things, and this huge debate starts. The historians are saying, we have to discredit everything this woman has said because 4 chimneys were not blown up, only 1 was, right? So we can discredit everything else in her interview. And Dory Laub says, no. Yes, she might have got the number wrong, but 1 chimney blowing up versus 4 chimneys, right? It's just as impossible. For them at that time, 4 chimneys versus 1 was still, one chimney blowing up was just as impossible as 4 chimneys blowing up, right? So we don't need to discredit everything that she has to say, because to her, it was just as fantastical of that 1 blowing up as it would have been 4, right? Because that should not have happened, right? It had never happened before. So I say all of this to say, with this interview, yes, it might not have happened the way that she recounts it, but there's something else going on there. And I think that's something that you all could talk to your students about, right? And start talking about oral history testimonies and, you know, the feasibility of them, right? And like the credibility of oral history interviews. So just as sort of a broader example here. Now, during the war, if a soldier, right, was found out to be a homosexual, right, or have homosexual tendencies, they would receive an undesirable discharge from the military. Okay, not an honorable discharge, not a dishonorable discharge, but an undesirable discharge. All right, so those suspected of being homosexuals would be tried in front of a military tribunal, and they would be discharged from service as undesirable. This affected them everywhere they went after the war was over, right? When a veteran came home and they tried to get a job, right, or if they were discharged from service early before the war ended and they were trying to find a job, the employer wanted to know, right, what did you do in the military, right? What was your service record like? And if you came home with an undesirable discharge, well, why were you undesirable, right? That starts to raise questions. And people kind of knew what these undesirable discharges were for. And so it was a stain on those service members, right, who actually fought during World War II. So they were no longer eligible for veterans benefits after the war, and they also had trouble finding employment. Yes.
Undesirable discharges only given to those suspected of homosexual behavior, or were they given to other groups?
They were given to others as well. From the research that I've done, I believe I've seen reference to others others receiving undesirable discharges, but it was mainly for those suspected of being homosexual. Yeah, great question. I don't have a number, unfortunately. The women, I'm trying to think. I think women were typically excluded from that. It was mainly men, but there may have been some women. I'm not 100% certain on that though. But I can do a little research and I can find out for you. Cool. So they had a very difficult time finding employment. So when they're desperate, I'm sure at this point, trying to find a job, but they can't find a job. They can't get benefits from the military because they've received this undesirable discharge. So a lot of them started to try and have their military record changed. They started writing letters to the American Red Cross, asking for their help. They started contacting various veterans organizations, and they were writing to congressional representatives and senators as well, trying to get their military record changed. But it was very, very difficult. That was a very difficult thing to do. So, question that I would ask students: when veterans were discharged from the military for being homosexual, what did they often come home to? How many say A? How many say B, C, or D? D, right? Difficult time getting benefits and a job. Now, trying to get their records changed from these undesirable discharges to honorable discharges, this started the early homophile movements of the 1950s and 1960s. What is homophile though, right? What do I mean when I say homophile? This is a movement of organizations that fought for the civil rights of homosexuals in the 1950s and 1960s. And we're gonna see how they did this in just a little bit. The first one was the Veterans Benevolent Association. It was founded in 1949 by a group of gay veterans. And they were dedicated, at least at first, to helping gay and lesbian veterans basically change their undesirable discharges to honorable discharges so that they could get those benefits and that they could finally get jobs. The organization, though, didn't last very long, and there's not a whole lot of information out there because it became this social club where they were throwing dances and other social gatherings for gays and lesbians, gay and lesbian veterans, their families. And so they kind of lost their way a little bit, and they didn't really get a whole lot done. So it just didn't really do much, and it didn't last for very long, maybe a couple of years or so. But this is the first instance of a gay or a homosexual-centered veterans organization. Okay, again, trying to help veterans win, the right to get those benefits and get those honorable discharges. The Mattachine Society, though, was founded in 1950, so a year later, by groups of friends and organizers, including World War II veterans. This gentleman right here in the glasses, we're going to talk about him in just a moment. But he was one of this is a group actually of the original founders at a little Christmas party. This is the first registered homophile organization in the United States. Okay. So registered, like with the government. All right. So it was a huge, huge deal. Interestingly enough, the Mattachine Society, their lawyer that helped get them registered with the United States government was actually a straight man, also a veteran. His name was Herb Selwyn, Selwyn. I think that's right. Selwyn, yeah. Herb Selwyn was straight, married to a woman, but he really thought that these veterans had been marginalized and that they had been mistreated with these undesirable discharges. And so he helped the Mattachine Society get founded and get registered with the government. And he was a lawyer. Now, this society was originally designed to show society that homosexuals made up an oppressed cultural minority. But unfortunately, and there were, varying differences of opinion. It was hijacked by a certain group, members who thought that homosexuals would win their rights through conformity and respectability. So there were these differing opinions. Some said we need to, dress like everybody else. We need to act like everybody else, and really only be gay kind of at home, right? And then there was another faction that said, no, we need to be ourselves, right? And we need to show the world that we are here. And so it kind of got split up through this. But the Mattachine Society, there's still a couple of them left, and they're more historical, societies. There's Mattachine Society of DC, and it's more of a history archives kind of organization. By the mid-60s, most of the Mattachine societies had been sort of disbanded because, again, there were all of these factions and differences of opinion on how to operate things. So this is that gentleman in the glasses there. His name is Chuck Rowland. He was born in 1917. He is a veteran of World War II, served in the U.S. Army, and he was also an organizer for various organizations after the war, including the American Veterans Committee. And then he went on to be one of the co-founders of the Mattachine Society in 1950. But that was one of his jobs. He was an organizer for a lot of these different kinds of organizations. Howard Hay, who was one of the other co-founders, he was a big organizer for the Communist Party, sort of during World War II and after, until they founded the Mattachine Society. And Chuck Rowland did an interview where he discussed he talked about the discussion that began the Mattachine Society, and he said that was the first time I know of that gays were referred to as an oppressed cultural minority. But gay people didn't want to be an oppressed cultural minority. Why? We're just like everybody else. So, why do you think this quote's significant? Okay. What do you think Rowland meant by an oppressed cultural minority? Again, these are questions you can ask your students, right? Kind of makes sense to us, but these are questions that you could potentially ask your students. What do you think he means by that? Yeah.
Or did ammo if they were weak, not.
Oh, interesting. Explain that a little bit more.
Say they're oppressed or something like that, maybe think they lost and they're weak or something like that, maybe just people who are from the outside wanted to oppress.
Yeah. So it makes them a little less weak, right?
Yeah.
Because they're being oppressed. It's coming from the outside. It's not them themselves.
I think to on that point, it's also one of the only groups that had the discharge, right? So you weren't discharging African American or Japanese American. This was something that was kind of hidden, so you weren't sure who they were. You had to leave them out. Quote unquote, so they're more. You probably thought they were more oppressed. Well, and then there's a unique culture to this group, that they can also be African American, they can also be Mexican American, that they also have this unique culture within those groups as well.
Yeah. You can be men, you can be women, you can be Black, you can be Hispanic, you can be white, you can be a lot of different things, right? Absolutely.
So when I think of cultural minority, I'm trying to fit that somewhere. And so cultural minority, maybe artists in general, but are artists oppressed? Are they able to freely practice their art? So this is the cultural minority that's oppressed. So they're not able to be themselves. They're not able to do what it is that makes them, I don't want to say unique, but a culture.
I understand what you're saying.
I'm trying to take cultural minority and figure out who's a cultural minority. And then how you become a threat cultural minority. Because in the gay community, you have artists, but you also have school teachers and attorneys and doctors. And so this cultural minority, what is that?
Are you asking or are you just like,
I want to know, what is a cultural minority? How are we going to define cultural minority?
anybody else want to think about
Language, it's music, it's dance, it's your traditions, what things you do with your family. That's how I teach it with my students. It's all kinds of.
The elements that they do.
Oh, I don't think, when he says that we would want to be in the cultural minority, the world knows what that looks like, so why would we want to start a group of people not treated as you should be?
Anybody else? Any thoughts on that? Or just saying, we're here, we're part of it.
We're here, we're already part of culture, we're just like everybody else, but we are being oppressed, right? And we are part of the minority that is being oppressed by the outside, right? Yeah.
Really positive, beginning, I mean, like going to the military, they do ask about breast communities, et cetera, but that is something that is actually policy against engage the military at that point, or?
Yeah.
And then they didn't actually ask a question about that at the beginning of the recruitment, was it? Or?
Yeah, so they had during your essentially physical, right? If you were drafted or if you join, you have to go through the whole physical process. They would do a physical examination, but then they would also do sort of a psychological examination. And it was the policy to not allow homosexuals into the military. And so they would ask questions, right? Have you ever had feelings for another man? Have you ever been with another man? Have you ever, do you like men, right? Or do you like women? They would ask these questions. And if you said no, end of discussion, right? Unless maybe you walked a certain way or you talked a certain way or your hand gesture, you made hand gestures that were a little, gay. Then they would probably be, they would say, okay, you're not eligible for service. But again, as the war went on and they needed more and more soldiers, it was just, are you gay? No. Welcome to the military, right? They didn't really look into it any further. Even though it was technically policy, I think they were just so desperate for people to fight that they were willing to overlook that. But they had like a team of psychologists and psychiatrists actually asking these questions to potential, recruits.
The initial lawyer involved. You mentioned, I don't, you didn't know that was legal leg to stand on, even though it's not good policy, it's goes against, inclusive military. I mean, he wasn't suing for their rights necessarily, was he? Or just,
No, he was just helping them sort of get established and get registered as an official sort of organization in the United States. So he wasn't necessarily suing the government or anything for their rights. He was just helping them sort of get those, get new legal rights, essentially, being able to be an organization in the first place. That was really what he was there for.
One question, ask me, what is the origin of the action?
I knew you were going to ask that. So if I remember correctly, and I'll have to look it up and I can let you guys know later, but if I remember correctly, it is a reference to Greek history, Greek or Roman history, but I can't remember precisely. So I'll get back to you guys on that. I do apologize. Yeah, I should have known somebody was going to ask that. Dang it. One other individual that I want to introduce y'all to is Christine Jorgensen. Christine Jorgensen was actually born George William Jorgensen in 1926. He was drafted into the US military as a man, but after, even during World War II, he felt like he was in the wrong body. He felt like he really should have been a woman. And so in 1952, beginning in 1952, he traveled to Copenhagen, Denmark. He underwent sexual reassignment surgery and came back to the United States as Christine Jorgensen. The picture in the background is actually Christine arriving back to the United States, and she's doing this big press conference after she has recovered from this sexual reassignment surgery. And she becomes this sort of overnight celebrity. This is the first time that a trans person has gone public with their journey. And it was a huge deal. She becomes a movie star. She writes a memoir. She becomes very famous in her own right, but the publicity of her surgery helped her become this huge public figure and sort of inspiration, empowerment figure for other trans individuals here in the United States. And I just included this cutout image here because it's just fabulous. But she had this to say: the answer to the problem must not lie in sleeping pills and suicides that look like accidents or in jail sentences, but rather in life and freedom to live it. Right? Pretty powerful. What's she saying though? What is Christine saying with this?
You want to be, you don't have to hide and not live, and live, you want to live. I mean, that we should be focusing on the health of this marginalized group. Who feels necessary to turn people from, suicide. So I think it's just what I'm going to do.
A lot of the mental health, probably their solution was, oh, that's going to be speaking, they'll forget all about it, it's changing the behavior. And stops and the answer. And yeah, be who you are, don't have to apologize. And be who you are.
Alcohol, pills, suicide is not the answer.
Never was, right? Very good.
You should really change, put it out, like my brother, and then it's a problem that needs to be solved with different remedies. It's just really hard.
Yeah. Say that one more time.
The early childhood identity is not a problem that needs to be solved or medicated with stress.
My gender identity is not a problem to be solved or medicated. It just is. It's just who I am. Right.
And we're not even dealing with
PTSD is like. So, I mean, that's like, I think, a whole different level for people to deal with when they're not even dealing with World War II veterans and PTSD.
Yeah. I mean, we knew about PTSD. It was called shell shock at the time, right? Because they thought the shells that were dropping in World War II were like rattling everybody's brains and making them crazy and catatonic and whatnot. We've done a lot of research on trauma theory and PTSD and all of that kind of stuff, but it wasn't until like 60s, 70s that it's really, starts to get that name of post-traumatic stress disorder. Yeah.
Well, and it's interesting, this is what 1950 is, she said, the first,
I actually think this quote comes from a little bit later, like maybe in like the 70s or 80s, but yeah.
first diagnostic statistical manual for the American psychology comes out, that first edition, and that first edition labeled homosexuality as a true psychotic disorder. And so they had an uphill battle from even to that very first edition.
Yeah, it wasn't until, when did they take that out? I think it was like the late 90s or early 2000s or so. Was it 1970 that they took it out? It was relabeled. A disorder, right? So that it was the 80s, okay. What do you think this quote may have meant to other people who were struggling with their identity, and why?
Because why? Well, because kids struggle with so many issues, not just identity, but with peer pressure and expectations, and I just feel like they need to know that there are other options than their life. It's exactly who you are.
And it doesn't have to just mean, it doesn't have to just be for LGBTQ plus kids, right? It's just people in general, right? And I think that's what's so powerful about this quote, is it doesn't just apply to this oppressed cultural minority, right? As we've been talking about, this applies to everybody, right? Just be who you are. So what I talked about earlier in, how much time do we have left? We're at 10 minutes? Yikes. Okay, thank you. So, 16 minutes, even better, perfect. So we talked about, these two factions in the Mattachine Society and in some of these other early homophile movements that were wanting to conform, right? Show that we're just like everybody else, dress like everybody else, talk like everybody else. And so we're now going to go from this sort of conformity part of the gay rights movement to uprisings. And so we're going to do a little primary source analysis. What's a primary source? Some of the time period, right? Very good. All right, so let's analyze this. What do you see in this image? A bunch of men, okay. What else?
These signs,
Holding signs, all right?
not all white,
Okay, not all white,
Varying ages.
varying ages.
all the signs reference the war.
Okay, so all the signs reference the war in one way or another. What do you think is happening in the photograph? Why do you think that?
It's the direction all the neighbor.
Okay, they're all facing the same direction. Looks like maybe they're listening to somebody or something. What else? Maybe a protest with the signs, right?
The flowers.
It's peaceful.
Okay, it's peaceful.
Well, in the back, you can see on the sets that they're sure.
Interesting. So you see the people in the background on the steps, they're sort of spectating, right? They're not actively participating, but they're kind of looking and seeing what's going on. What are the men in this photograph wearing? All dressed fairly nice. You got suits and ties. Others are wearing like, so it looks like a button up and a cardigan, right? Why do you think they're wearing this kind of clothing?
Either March or.
They're blending in. Why do you say that?
Opposed to a march that we might see now, you know, there are no rainbow flags, there are no one's in drag. These are just guys you might bump into on the street on an everyday basis.
Yeah, absolutely. So when I did this for the homeschool group, I had a homeschool parent that was like, huh, doesn't look like anything that we have today. Like made some kind of like offhanded comment. Was like was like something like wish they would, you know, act like this today or something. I was like, okay, we're gonna just move on. But yeah, they're dressed like a normal. I say normal. That's not the right word. You guys know what I mean. But they're dressed in these suits. They're trying to show that they're just like everybody else, right? They're an average Joe that just happen to be holding protest signs that talk about homosexuality, right?
So they go back to quote before, rather than like these are the only people for my mortgage, you know, we're just like everybody else.
Just like everybody else. Yeah, absolutely. Right. And so there would be, you know, there are also protests outside of Congress, there's videos of them like outside the White House and other federal buildings here in Washington, D.C., where they're marching with signs and it's men and women, and they're all dressed very, you know, conservatively, in suits, in, you know, dresses of the time period, and they're marching, but all of their signs are like, I'm a lesbian and I deserve rights, or I'm a gay man and I deserve rights, right? It was all about that conformity, looking and acting just like everybody else to show that we are just like everybody else. No, this is outside of a federal building. I can't remember exactly where, but they are protesting, and this is from the early 60s. And obviously homosexuals were accepted in World War II. Why not now, right? Homosexuals serve honorably by perjuring themselves, by lying about who they are, right? I served honorably. And there's their, you know, discharge paperwork that they have on the sign. And I'll show you another picture of that. Are there any protest signs that stand out to you? Sorry, I should have asked that before I went over all of them.
That don't tell, homosexuals are honorably about perjuring themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. Don't ask, don't tell. Homosexuals serve honorably by perjuring themselves, right? And you can ask your students, why did those particular protest signs stand out to you, right? Say it one more time.
He's a lawyer.
Why do you say that? Oh, yeah, right. That's a good observation. I hadn't made that before. But it wasn't until actually 10 years before the Stonewall Inn uprising of 1969, beginning in 1959, there were a series of riots. So that's why I say from sort of conformity to uprisings. So again, in the 1950s and early 1960s, these homophile organizations made very little to no headway fighting for homosexual rights and even rights for veterans, because again, there were these splits, right, within these organizations of how best to fight for these rights. But again, it wasn't until 1959 with the Cooper Donuts riot in Los Angeles that led to a lot more inclusion and visibility of homosexuals. So you have Cooper Donut riots, 1959, the Black Knight Brawl at the Black Knight Bar in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, where a group of veterans had heard about this gay bar, and they're like, hey, let's go, sort of terrorize this bar. And the gay patrons of this bar came out and essentially beat the crap out of them. You have Compton's Cafeteria riot in 1966. This is actually a photo from that riot, drag it out in the open. And you have this drag queen who's standing there with that really powerful kind of stance. And then you have the Stonewall Inn uprising in 1969, which leads to the first gay pride parade and the formation of the gay liberation movement, starting in 1969, 1970. Yes, and it is a national park site now. Thank you so much. You can still go visit it today, and they've got a little park outside, and they've got like a little memorial and a statue and things. So it's a really cool place. Very empowering. So let's put this history into practice, right? I want you to talk amongst yourselves, and those online, if you want to come up with some ideas, you can type them into the chat box there. But in small groups, just or with partners next to you, just brainstorm an idea of how you could incorporate this history into a lesson in your classroom. I'm going to take just a few minutes to do that. Pear Deck, yes.
Yeah.
I like Pear Deck.
I love Paradise.
Yeah, we.
Talk about your, like, in our classes, we would add that to, like, to get the kids to
Yeah.
do it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I used Kahoot whenever I did this because I'm like, I wanted to do something more interactive, and I wanted to do like kind of a project.
All right, it's got about 30 more seconds.
All right, it sounds like everybody's sort of dying down just a little bit. Anybody want to share very briefly what you all talked about?
Well, we talked about how joining the military is perceived as a way to start your future, you know, to get an education when you out now, and then imagining that you're joining to kind of have a career path or some training, and then having that taken away from you because you have a different sexual orientation than what is acceptable at that time. You know, these were people who didn't, at that time, didn't join thinking, oh, I'm going to get a free education out of it, because that wasn't part of it. And I'm going to defend my country and democracy and all of these things that I've been taught growing up. And now I'm kicked out, and for what? We talked about how we could talk about the event, if you read her quotes, but how can we still use that? What's the context of what's going on? And also how we have to use synthesis. So how, for the example, so how does this synthesize with the civil rights movement and the 14th Amendment?
Absolutely. I mean, the whole movements and the civil rights movements, organizations, they were all working together because they saw the same struggle, right? They were all fighting essentially the same struggle. And so some organizations, not all, but some organizations did decide to sort of join together and fight for these rights together, which I think is really cool. Anybody else? Okay, very briefly, because I'm just about out of time. I think I have like 1 or 2 minutes left. My thought for an activity would be to interview a veteran, a gay or a lesbian veteran. You can actually contact local veterans groups and ask if they have anyone who'd be willing to sit for an interview with your students, either individually or as a class. Some of the organizations to consider are here these are sort of gay and lesbian military veterans organizations. Some of them have to do with like the USNA Out and Nights Out. Those have to deal with like the Naval Academy and with West Point. They're sort of alumni associations, but I'm sure they would be willing to help you out with this. But have your students draft a series of interview questions for the veteran, and they should include questions about their childhood, their military service, coming out, how service defined their character, and how service shaped their fight for equal rights in and out of the military. And then if the interviewee is comfortable with the idea, consider recording the interview for posterity. Ensure that students write and mail thank you notes to the interviewees, which I know we all know. Students today don't know how to write a thank you note, so that's going to be a whole lesson in and of itself. But a very important one. And finally, conduct a class discussion with students about what they learned from the interview. What did they take away? How did the interview differ from what they thought it would be? What might they have done differently? And if they could go back and ask a different question, what would they ask? Just some kind of fun follow-up sorts of questions. But again, I served honorably. Using their experience in service, lesbian and gay veterans of World War II played instrumental roles in the formation of early homophile movements here in the United States. This is where I got my images from. I'm here if you have any questions, but I am not going to eat into our lunchtime. So, because I know we're all getting antsy and a little hungry. So Thank you guys very much for allowing me to come and do this today. I really appreciate it. Y'all have been really awesome. Thank you again. If you have any questions, come ask me later.